Oh, so welcome back from lunch. I hope you're having a great quality of life here in London. It's certainly impressing me. And I think it's a very interesting group of people. I've missed a little bit of the workshop, but I think these topics are very engaging. When Colin asked me to help recruit some people to the workshop for these topics, I was thinking, you know, diversity matters. The perspective of quality of life from London is not the same as from Portland, Oregon. And so what's missing, I think, is, you know, the Asian culture of cities, and especially the emerging geography challenge of cities. And then I think in the news you've seen quality of life. You know, there's happiness indexes. That's hard to be confident you have right. But fear, uncertainty, and doubt indexes, I think, are clear. So when you read the story of India, and you read some problems with their transit system, that's very high on the fear and quality of life scale, those kind of stories. So I ask my friends at Tata to introduce me to the guy who could talk about quality of life, you know, city by city, and culture by culture. And the culture issues are not just like happiness, they're also like fear. And they're not just like old white guys making money. It's also women, you know, trying to get safely between their home and their grocery store. So Samir's the head of Tata's eco-services practice and has broad experience in industry, and then is the leader on the topic of sustainability and urban development. So Samir, correct what I said and give us the real biases that you'd like to share with us.
Thank you. I think I've got the mic.
Okay, good.
Thanks, Dan. Thank you for the opportunity. So he asked for an expert in all the things he just mentioned, and he got me. So I hope I can do some justice. Now, talking about the quality of life immediately after lunch is an interesting opportunity. And I'm going to try and make the best of it. What I'm going to do is, I was really fascinated by the collaborative, and apologies for missing some of the earlier aspects, and I hope to interact with you later in the day as well. But what I found fascinating was, at conferences like this, we talk about digital information flow, and you've got the adaptive city, the personalized city, you've got all these various elements which is more technical and hierarchical, and you sometimes miss the key element which actually kind of brings all this together, which is the people. And really my focus here is to try and talk a little bit more about that, so that we stop getting as scared of uncertainty. We're all very comfortable with ones and zeros. We're all very comfortable with things that we can quantify, things that we can see, things that we can measure, things that we can manage, and there's enough management jargon to go around on that. I think we need to start getting much more comfortable about things that we can't measure, things that we can't manage, and spend more time not necessarily trying to quantify the unquantifiable. I don't think we need another NPP problem that we need to discuss, but figuring out how we live with that. And what I'm going to do is do a couple of things. I'm going to try and set little context so that I just ensure that I'm kind of using the same lexicon. I then want to talk a little bit about some of the models and frameworks that Stan mentioned. I have some of my biases will be clear with that. And then talk a little bit about some of the examples of what it means, and which is why I've really kind of focused in around that measurement and management, because the quality of life itself is such a subjective topic that, I mean, my initial premise is probably flawed already. I'm not going to be able to, at least I'm not going to get the same measurement as anybody else in this room. So I think that's really the kind of essence of, I think, what I want to focus on. But I do want to leave you with what I think are some next steps, and I believe things that we can do. And there's some great stuff that's happened in the smart city world and the intelligent cities and all these aspects. But I think there are a few elements we need to add to that umbrella. So that's really the premise of what I'm going to kind of talk through for the next half an hour or so. Feel free to interrupt me at any point if you want to kind of ask questions, if that's all right. I'd like to make this as interactive as possible. So again, as I said, the 4 areas that I really want to cover in this conversation. So from the objectives, I think I kind of stole the first 3 from your initial note around the adaptive city, the personalized city, the supportive city. And then we come to the perceptions of quality of life. I think there's one other element that you might want to think about is the failed city. All right? The ability to actually measure the health of a city. What are the canaries in the coal mine? What are the frogs in the delta for a city? I had a case of jet lag last night and had the opportunity to watch Requiem to Detroit on BBC4. And I was scared out of my wits. I don't know if you guys have seen it. If you haven't, highly, highly recommend. It was an amazing documentary. It was an amazing documentary. And it was, again, one of those things where, in the US at least, there's been all kinds of debates about, why Detroit is in the state it's in, and is it the first of many, or is it, the beginning of the end of the beginning, or whatever you want to call it. But what was fascinating was the seeds of the present situation. I mean, they were tracing it back to 1929. They were tracing it back to the birth of suburbia. They were tracing it back to the big 3 automakers. So again, you may have the most interconnected city. You may have all these parameters that might fit right. But if you haven't looked after the people aspect, the quality of life aspect, the whole edifice is going to fall on you. So one of the questions I kind of asked myself is, definition of city and urban, and I've got a few formal definitions up there. But one of the things that really kind of struck me was this whole concept of a city as a living organism. Right? It ingests raw natural resources, and it emits waste. It's living, it's breathing. But we are not in a good enough position to really set the aspects of what the health check are. I think the City Vitals program, actually, I thought was very interesting, Stan, that you forwarded to me earlier, which tries to do some aspects of it, where it's got a bunch of parameters which it tries to kind of measure on connectivity and innovation and aspects like that. But I think the part that it misses out is how do you then incorporate some of those findings in the running of the city itself? And one of the challenges that I find with a lot of the conversations that happens with some of the smart city conversations that I've seen is again around the infrastructure, is around the bandwidth, is around the application, is around the building of some of these systems. And I come from Tata Consultancy Services, so I am guilty of all those things that I've just mentioned because that's what drives my engine. But we don't always think about the impact it actually has on the quality of life. I'm going to talk about an example that I mentioned to Stan, which is what kind of got us interested to actually talk about this subject, was the concept of safety. So when I was in India, this was about 8 or 10 years ago actually, the whole business process, the BPO revolution was really kind of taking off in India. And again, some of this will really resonate based on some of the not so nice things that happened in a bus in Delhi a few months ago. So the whole idea was we had this company that used to ferry their employees back to their homes. And we built a little app with a phone company which essentially recognized when the person with that phone entered the bus. And it recognized, it registered when the person left the bus. Not a very complicated app. It's fairly straightforward and simple. The initial reason they did it was not safety. The initial reason was to check the route that the bus driver was actually taking. So again, the reason for it was driven by fuel efficiency, how much petrol are you using, what route did you take, et cetera, et cetera. But the impact on safety was huge, because I could actually tell at a particular point in time when an individual got in and left. Now, that, I believe, is something that improves the quality of life. Not the fact that there are 2 billion cell phones for 1 billion Indians. But the fact that I can use that to do something like this, that has an impact on the quality of life. Unfortunately, there aren't any measures for that. I'll measure tele-density. I'll measure the number of cell phones. I'll measure all these other things that I've mentioned, but I'm not going to measure the amount of how safe the world actually became, or for those set of individuals. Similar example again, where on the coast of Kerala, when the fishermen would come in with their daily catch, they would basically come into a particular spot, and depending on what the catch was for the group that came into that spot, that's how the prices were. So if everybody had a good catch, the prices weren't that good. Enter the cell phone. Increase range. People start calling before they're coming in to check who's come in. What's the range of the catch? Is there an opportunity for me to go a little further north or go a little further south to get more for what I've actually done? So I think the problem is, and again, there are a number of, you'll probably have a number of examples like this in various areas where applications have kind of enabled things or made things better. The point that I'm trying to make is typically things like this are not captured when you look at how to improve the status or the quality of life in a city. And it becomes difficult because, as I said, again, because you're getting so subjective about it, what improves the quality of life in a city? How do you measure that? Now, I think one of the conversations we were having earlier up is, while it's difficult for me to put a quantifiable aspect saying, am I 0.75% happy, or am I a Gini coefficient of happiness, I can tell you if I'm happy or not. And I think increasingly we need to be comfortable with that kind of knowledge to actually make some of these choices. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the models that have kind of referred to the same concept, particularly the work that was done by Professor Stiglitz around the beyond GDP concept, where there are 3 specific models in this space. Now, after having said all that about templates and formats, I cannot resist the temptation to put up a template. So one of the things we did is we looked at a couple of, you've got your classic parameters. We looked at, one of the focuses I have is around the environment side. And one of the things we tried to incorporate was how do we think about things like land, energy, water, waste, air, and carbon, which we believe were 6 key factors of eco-competitiveness. So we identified the key constituents of a city, government, corporations, and I think we used to call them civil society before, but that meant the rest were not civil, so I kind of changed it to citizens instead. A set of core infrastructures, building, utility systems, communication systems, a set of service infrastructure, and then some key enablers like technologies, skills and capabilities, finance, innovation. The reason for a format like this was to try and use this to try and measure the health of a city. And the part that I get particularly interested about is the aspects over here around knowledge management and compliance, and particularly around intelligence. And I think Stan and I have had this conversation before, where I see so many people getting excited about big data and what big data can do and how to deal with big data. And absolutely, you're going to generate volumes of data. The whole concept of big data is very important. But in my mind, big data becomes really important when you've got specific intelligence. So if I'm able to actually, use that for something that you or a group or something specific requires, as opposed to generating more and more volumes of data. So how can I actually use that back as a control mechanism for what I actually do? So we actually use this. This principle was something that we employed in terms of building eco-cities, where we were actually using a framework like this, looking at the design element of each of the core or service infrastructures as well as enablers, and identifying how sustainable they could be. So the idea was, if each of these building blocks were sustainable, we would actually have a more sustainable township. Please.
So, when there was doing total quality analysis of the industry, there's a lot of questions. So should you start with the customer debottleneck quality from the customer back through the supply chain? Or should you start at the manufacturing site and debug the quality at the manufacturing site and trickle it forward to the market? And there was a very clear answer to that. One works and one doesn't. And so I think applying the same thing to the templates of cities is a challenge. Analyzing a city utility by utility is kind of like analyzing a car subsystem by subsystem. That doesn't correlate to the quality of a car. So do you have any comments on that?
Well, I think one of the big differences, I believe, is the interrelations that exist make it difficult to actually look at it as a subsystem by subsystem. You almost have to look at it as either a vertical or a horizontal slice. So it's not about, am I happy with the electricity in my city, or am I happy with because then those are kind of on-off kind of switches. I may be happy on a particular day because things are working fine. I may not be if things are late. But you start getting into things like time, and they start getting bound on areas like that. I think for something like the quality of life, or even when you look at the quality of this thing of system, you've got to start taking vertical or horizontal slices as opposed to specific subsystems. Now this may be semantics, and I don't have the answers for it, and would love to kind of hear what what other people think. But I think increasingly you've got to look at the system approach, and in some cases what I find again is, and again we had to start with small steps. So initially we started by just ensuring we had enough bandwidth. So if I'm going to do all this stuff, I better have the base infrastructure before I start creating all these things that are going to use these resources. So we've taken those initial steps. Now we really need to start thinking about, and I think the interesting thing that's going to come up as well is you've got different challenges ahead of you. You've got China with 12 to 24 cities coming up every year, number of ghost cities coming up, no one to live there. We've got the cities. So you've got that whole new city concept. We had an issue in India, for example, when we had the whole slum development program. And these were extremely popular in Bombay, where the developer would take over a particular aspect of a slum and convert part of it into a building, give some flats in that to people who lived in the and in some cases they gave them flats that were much further away, fancy flats with all the modern amenities, but in an area where they couldn't get work. So there was a new slum that was being created pretty soon after they got that building. And they would then sell that, get a lot of money for it because it was out somewhere else, but they were back then into all the same health and sanitation issues. Sorry.
I just want to make it a bit more complicated, what you just said. I think the problem is worse, that it's not just that the components of the city make up the experience overall of the city. It's also that within that system, the citizen is not the equivalent of an employee or a basic customer. So all the traditional IT concepts where the employee has a role and fulfills a certain business process, or a customer primarily ends up with a transaction in buying something in a city, the citizen is quite irrational. And the principal, he is the voter, he makes choices, he follows completely random judgment and personal judgments on that. So this idea that you can apply systems theory or be demand-led and predict also how they behave in the system, I think is very complicated. And I think the IT and technology industry right now, therefore, hasn't found actually yet a language or method or an approach to dealing with what you just described. I'm not sure academia is there either. I thought with Colin, the discussion in Austria recently about this urban system science is starting to address that issue, but we're a bit in a vacuum here. I think we're currently experimenting all with the question you asked, and when you throw the citizen into that, that's another dimension, make it even more complicated.
That's an interesting point. I think so. I think you're right. It's I'm throwing in an active participant of another. As you said, they can have different roles in that system, and at different points they may have different aspects. The other kind of way to think about it almost is how do you, potentially, one is the language for the IT team, but how do you kind of potentially start thinking about the citizen not as a single role, but as someone who may have multiple roles that they may actually fit into. So if I think of, as an abstract, and then you've got various instantiations of the citizen in different situations. I mean, no answer yet, but...
Is one of the differences that a citizen is kind of a co-creator of the city, as opposed to an employee or a consumer? And it depends how they engage in the city, what they get out of the city. So it is a much more interactive role, and perhaps one of the measures of quality is how interactive citizens are with the city.
I mean, level of engagement, for example, and it's interesting, but if you think about a startup, right? You think about a startup organization. I was the CEO and the peon at the same time sometimes. So I think it's not that much different. It's because I think we've got to kind of look at in different stages. Now I think the interesting thing is in a city, you probably it's the maturity of the city doesn't necessarily change the number of roles that you might actually play in that city. But I think what's important to recognize is I think it is not a single role. It's going to be multiple roles, and it's going to change with time and maturity. It's going to change with a number of different factors, which definitely makes it more complicated. But I think that's where technology has advanced, where we can process these scenarios that we couldn't do before. So that's an interesting kind of idea where, well... So
good luck with your template.
I've already patterned. I've got an app ready, Stan. So I need to put it on People Power. So the whole idea, for example, I remember when your phones, right? Your phones have profiles on them, right? And I think again we had this conversation where I had the president of a utility company tell me we were sitting in this room and we were defining how we're gonna set the based on cold degree days and hot degree days and various elements of humidity, and he just got up finally. He said, hold it. All I want 3 buttons. First button says, I feel super green today. Second button says, somewhere halfway. And the third button says, I'm a caveman. You figure it out in the background, what the profiles need to be. I want to be able to press those 3. So I want to be in a situation, back to your point, where based on my role as a citizen, I'm able to do certain things. And my information is tracked accordingly based on the situation. Couple of quick thoughts in terms of just, urbanization and context. You guys have been talking about this for a while, so I'm probably preaching to the choir, but it's just frightening in terms of just the numbers, and just in terms of the number of cities that China is adding, and where all that urban growth is going to come from. It's going to come from an area where the infrastructure is just not there. I mean, we're talking about, you're talking about smart cities. I'm talking about barely functioning cities, right? In addition, you've got some rather old cities that need upgrades. So again, one of the things that I find puzzle in this whole smart city, intelligent city concept is one solution for, I'm going to make everything interconnected and I'm going to link everything up and you're going to be able to, reach the Jetsons age, whatever the concept might be, because you've got different phases of the issue. You've got, and I think increasingly, that's why the quality of life aspect doesn't get the same attention it needs. So I just thought it was kind of interesting just to look at, just some of the numbers, and you're talking about the urban millennium, which I think was 2007 or so, I think, where you had more people living in urban and in rural, and even in some sense the definition of rural. I don't know how many of you have had the chance to visit India. In the north of India and in parts of Kerala as well, you can't really tell when you're in a rural area, some parts of it. I mean, these places have pretty decent infrastructure. They are fairly high income. So a number of things that, when I go back to my definition of city and urban, it's not the, the village field and skyscrapers. These are starting to get a lot more blurred. And you talk about tier 2 cities, you talk about, so it's kind of a continuum almost. And I think this whole urban-rural concept, in my mind, I'd love to kind of hear your views on it, is getting a little outdated. Because, some of the challenges that are being faced are not that much different. Scale, yes, I agree, is different, and there are some additional baggage on the urban side that sometimes may not be there. The rural side might give me more of a greenfield kind of start, but a lot of the aspects are more similar than different in my mind, and probably even more in the developed world. If you may have a village idiot and you may not have one in the city, but I don't know. So how do you really differentiate between this whole concept? So we call ourselves the urban systems collaborative. What are some of the things that you're talking about here that don't apply to a rural area in the developed world? Maybe this percentage concept might even become immaterial. So this comes back to something I just mentioned earlier in terms of just the two unique challenges. So you've got all these new cities, primarily in the developing economies, Africa, Asia, where you're establishing the infrastructure, you're creating the rules and regulations, you're developing the character and the ecosystem. You can have examples like Masdar, where you have lots of money to spend, and even there things get bogged down when the economy is not doing that well. But on the other hand, you also have existing cities, where in some cases this is actually more difficult. I always remember the case of I went to school in the US, and however the Indian cell phone industry was leaps and bounds ahead, because you were stuck. It was the old competency trap, right? You had these old phones, you had the old color system, so they got there sooner, but it was the winner's curse or bleeding edge or whatever you wanted to call it. So this is kind of comes back again to the fact of how we're creating some of our solutions, and maybe when we think about smarter cities, I love your smarter planet. That was some amazing marketing that was done a long time ago. But let's really redefine what that means. It's not just about having things connected. It's not having the fanciest lights or the fanciest thoroughfares or whatever. It could be different for different parts of the world, for different cities based on their maturity levels. And that's not a bad thing. Because one of the things I find quite interesting is, and this comes back to something I mentioned around the quantification aspect, right? We're all so keen on getting that one number, right? So on the carbon footprint, everyone went to tons of carbon equivalent. And lots of consultants made a lot of money figuring out how to translate all this, NOx and SOx into carbon equivalents. But when you go to the doctor, does the doctor tell you, okay, you're a number 3 today? He doesn't. He checks your pulse. He has a set of vital signs. He doesn't have one number for you. That's not going to help you. He's got 4 or 5 levers that enables him to understand how your body's functioning. That is exactly what all systems need to look like. It's a system. It's not, it's nice for us because we like to rank things, we like to compare things, so we want one number and we say, okay, here's my ranking. But that comfort takes away from actually the quality of life and the quality of the system itself. So let me look at a few models I think that we mentioned. So this was one which I actually kind of found quite interesting, the whole genuine progress indicator. Again, we did a fair bit of work with Professor Stieglitz, Richard Levin, Montek Singh Ahluwalia around this whole concept of beyond GDP. And we looked at a bunch of these areas, and I think genuine progress indicator actually is quite an interesting one. I'm not going to go to the details of what these various systems are, but I mean, the idea essentially is they're looking at it as an alternative to GDP. Now, what's interesting is GDP never really claimed to be an indicator of progress or an indicator of, it had a very narrow definition when it was developed. We then decided to use that as the proxy for everything, including how we felt in the morning. Oh, GDP growth rate of 7.3%. Oh, this is good. India's doing well. We've had parties lose elections because they thought India was shining, but most of India wasn't. The GDP said 10%, but farmers were committing suicide. So again, I think it's, I think GDP fills a role. It's important, it's required, but it depends on how we're actually using it. This was, again, just some data around, how this is by redefining progress. The last information I found on these guys was 2006. I've not been able to find anything after that. I don't know if any of you have interacted with this group, and I don't know if they've...
Because Santa just has a new paper. Maybe Thad knows about it.
I'm right here.
Oh.
Yeah. I think that was more, was it happiness, general progress?
No, genuine progress indicators. It's the same crowd.
CPI.
The key things includes natural capital.
Right, and the pollution, resource depletion, long-term environmental damage.
It's a very recent paper. It should be.
Okay, right. I mean, it'd be worth looking at, because one of the things that we were trying to do, so in about 10 years ago, there's a gentleman called Pawan Sukhdev, who led the TEEB program here in Europe, and we did some work with him. He built something called GISD. Don't ask me what it stands for, but there was some green and there was some strategic advisory part there. But it was essentially trying to do the natural capital for India. And what he did was he looked at various aspects like the value of fresh water and the value of education and health and sanitation and so forth. And it was a nice high-level piece of work which we're now trying to build into our everyday life. And I found this is quite an interesting, the little bit that I did read of it, and I would be interested to try and see how this can kind of move to the next level. Now, in all these aspects, one of the things I think we find again is we set our barriers or we set our targets potentially unrealistically. I mean, economists have been doing GDP and GDP calculation and PPP and all these other aspects. They're not suddenly going to take another three-letter acronym and say, all right, well, we're just going to put all that aside and now we're going to do GPI, or we're going to do happiness index, or we're going to do whatever, GNH, or whatever three-letter acronym you want to think of. But these all have a role to play. And I think what's interesting and what's important, I think, for practitioners like us is how do we apply this? So one of the things that we were trying to do was use some of those aspects with companies, with states. We did a lot of work in the northeast of India. Northeast of India is one of those areas where the industrial revolution has not quite happened the way it's happened in Gujarat or Maharashtra or some of these other Tamil Nadu. But if I were to look at it from a natural capital perspective, places like Arunachal Pradesh and Assam and Nagaland come right to the top. Fresh water, biodiversity, they're the lungs of the country in so many ways. So the way we actually worked on this was we worked with the chief ministers of some of these states saying, how do you develop a new model of development? Which doesn't need to follow, how do I get all the multinationals to set up, automotive factories and steel factories and all those other elements, because, I mean, if you want to beat John McEnroe, don't play him at tennis. Play cricket with him. You might have a better chance of beating him. So how do you actually define those elements to ensure that you can use some of these aspects in the specific areas that actually make sense? I took another example with the Social Progress Index that, again, I actually started my career at Monitor with Michael Porter. I didn't realize he was actually doing some of the work here. But again, very interesting in terms of looking at some of these aspects of human needs, well-being, and opportunity. Applies quite nicely to countries, and again is, at least the little bit that I saw of it, is being driven more to help ranking. Where does a company, so I think Sweden is right on top with the combination of these three elements. But again, the nice thing is while he has a composite score, he also has 3 individual scores. So if your particular interest is in well-being, you may have a different list to look at. If you're interested in opportunity, you may have a different list to look at. And again, as I said, the city vitals conversation actually had a number of these parameters. Some of the challenge, and I'll talk a little bit about the challenges, was in some cases, we seemed to try, in the need to try and get really exhaustive, we had parameters where I lost track of what the parameters were by the time I got to the end, because I had to go back, and that becomes a problem. Because so while I don't have a single number, I don't have 25 numbers as well. Blood pressure, temperature, pulse rate, 3, 4, 5 at most, as they say, the dashboard, right? You don't have everything about the car on the dashboard. Yes, Dan.
Well, I don't want to derail another template, but your use of medicine as an example is telling, because in the Western model of medicine, wellness is scientific. There's a pulse rate that's normal. There's some symptoms that are normal or not normal. But in Asian medicine, there's this holistic model of psychologically, how are you? And so Asians will have 2 doctors, the symptom doctor and the wholeness doctor. So if you are going to use these metrics, there's like GDP medicine, which is what we practice in the United States. And there's like wellness and nutrition, personal safety. The doctor doesn't really help you on a lot of personal well-being topics. So that's an opportunity for naturopaths as another practice of medicine to be more holistic. And I think the application of this as the U.S. practice of medicine is not a good example of an integrated metrics. It's a good example of an opportunity that this is kind of validating.
Interesting point. I must admit I didn't kind of go as deep into it in terms of some of the specifics. But again, the way I took it was, if I were in Assam, and if I were looking at this, what I would define as basic medical care may be very different from what you would define it as in Portland. Now, I understand that causes a problem where, if I'm comparing Assam to Portland, I'm using 2 different metrics. But in the situation you're comparing Assam to Portland, I have some additional questions for you. Why? What are you actually trying to do there? So I actually looked at it. So in my case, basic medical care may not necessarily be just all the allopathic or Western medicine. It would include some of these other. I think maybe the well-being aspect may not be there, but it would include some of the natural, naturopaths, the homeopaths, some of those other elements which would also be part of basic medical care in my mind. So. But I mean, I don't know. I don't know if they have been very strict in their, maybe they have, because if they but because they were comparing across countries, I thought, and that's what got me a little confusing again. Because if I were to look at what would apply for Sweden, I would then think about, well, should I do the same thing in Swaziland? And probably not. Wouldn't be the right thing to do. It's the whole DDT story in Borneo, right? So in terms of, well-meaning, but can lead to complex issues. Multiple happiness models. I had a gala over time just going through all these happiness models. Amazing. I mean, it's I don't know if there is something called an indexologist, but if there is one, this is his.
You work with Hunter Group.
We didn't know how to do our indices, but yeah, I mean, this was really kind of all kinds of surveys, gross national happiness. This was particularly, the GNH was particularly interesting in Bhutan because I used to do some work with Bhutan, and we used to kind of travel, and there were while it was a very interesting concept, the lack of being able to, I mean, this was where the quantifying aspect became a real challenge, where people didn't know. I mean, I knew I was happy or not, but if you put me on a GNH, I have no idea. I don't know how it's going to really, come out, and it's a fairly long list of things. So it essentially means, there's probably one person in Bhutan who actually knows if you're happy or not. So, so that becomes a challenge again, in terms of so. If you look at these various models, you kind of start looking at, some of these, these issues, particularly around, the measurement and monitoring, inherently subjective topics. and kind of convincing the established to adopt a new model. I mentioned this a little earlier as well. The whole idea of, as I said, being comfortable with incomplete data. So everything's not going to kind of fall into its neat little place. You know, when you're talking about the quality of life, you're going to have ranges. You're going to have, you know, and being comfortable with that to an extent where it allows you to take a choice. And maybe a logical or illogical choice, but it allows you to make a choice. And I think in my mind, when I look at something like the quality of life, I think we need to really focus more on how some of these elements that we can quantify or can kind of build some ranges around help us make some of those choices. So, you know, you can have your adaptive city, your personalized city, you can build the systems, you can build the infrastructure, and then it starts getting to, you know, depending on your situation, depending on the day, depending on your mood, and how do you define that? You would actually, you know, define what makes sense. And I think this is where, you know, Professor Stieglitz's work on the Beyond GDP actually is quite valuable, where I think they kind of talk about a couple of things. One is, I think he says, it's interesting, he says, getting rid of this unique preconception that you have a unique consensual measure of well-being. And I thought that just said, what do you mean? I mean, you know, I should be able to tell whether, you know, we have a state of well-being, and you don't. So that unique measure is not necessarily there. And I think he defines 3 areas. Again, I don't have the material here, but I'd highly recommend both the book called Beyond GDP as well as the paper that he wrote. I think he called something called the welfarist approach, which is utility and cognitive satisfaction driven. You've got the liberal approach, which is basically give people what they want. And you've got the perfectionist approach, which is essentially where you're actually saying you can actually measure the well-being independent of prejudices or preferences. So again, I found it an interesting note. It definitely helped with my jet lag issue. But it didn't really lead me to build another template. There was no template out of that one. It was interesting. It was interesting. It gave me a sense of, okay, here are 3 choices I can look at, but it didn't really help me make any choices in terms of how that would kind of move on the quality of life. I just want to kind of put up one example again with you know, some of the work that we've been doing at TCS. Again, this is with Singapore, and as soon as I say Singapore, I see a lot of people say, "Oh, that's Singapore. You can do lots of things in Singapore. Have you done anything like this in Bombay?" We have not. But it's interesting in terms of trying to build this iCity model with all these elements that I kind of described up front, you know, and you know, the ability to try and have these interconnected, you know, utilizing big data concepts. I spoke to you a little bit about the example of the safety aspect. We had a similar case around waste management. So the idea was, again, using RFID tags that enabled, again, initially it started because of petrol, monitor the route of the driver who was actually picking up the waste. But then it also led to, you know, effective management of the waste. And also, you know, they had a little, we actually did this in India, where we were actually looking to put a solar sensor that would actually trigger if the waste bin was full or not. So if it wasn't full, then you didn't need to actually go pick it up. You could let it be for a little longer, and you could kind of go on. So number of examples in the space all have impact on different elements of the quality of life. Again, I think in terms of the way forward, I kind of outlined you know, the 3 or 4 areas that you have. In my mind, I quite like the whole medical approach, and that's where you know, I kind of want to kind of finish up at, which is we may not get the signs right initially. We may have to experiment a little bit, but I think some concept of the vital signs, which is almost like a health check, which allows us to do some level of diagnostic, which then allows us to put us on either a recovery plan or an exercise plan that allows us to continue to stay fit. So I think that's the model that I kind of look at from a quality of life, and I believe that each individual or each group or each will perceive that quality of life aspect differently. And to try and do any different in terms of trying to set up the quality of life in Portland is X and the quality of life in LA is Y, I think maybe a bit of a fool's errand. I think there are ways to help people enhance their quality of life in their location in different ways. And there are different parameters we can look at, but it's got to be it's contextual. It's got to be linked to where the individual is rather than in some kind of ether. Now I'm going to stop talking. Questions, queries, thoughts? Yes?
I totally agree with your concept of trying to move away from all this quantitative measurement all the time and over-measuring, in fact, and not being able to do anything about it, etc. However, if we start taking a health check right, left, and center, would it prevent us from taking long-term decisions and long-term strategies for?
I see the point you're coming from, and do we start getting more driven by the quarters like businesses are? So everything is how. But again, if I'm able to combine some of my Eastern medicine philosophies, right? If I'm looking at yoga, or some of these things, I'm not looking at how to fix my current thing, but how do I continue to stay healthy? So I think the danger is there, and I think what's important, I think, is realize that we will make some mistakes up front. Let's not be afraid of those mistakes. So I think we need to run some of these pilots. We need to run, what are those 5 or 6 things, or 10 things that we actually want to look at. The problem is, city doesn't quite, it takes a longer gestation period than a human being. But I believe that I think we can plan for it. It's a danger, it's a risk that we need to acknowledge, but I think we can plan for it.
Have you got any examples of good measures?
I wish I had some answers for that. That would allow me to do my next startup, wouldn't it, Stan? No. I mean, again, I think there are. I think, as I said, the City Vitals program, which when I had a chance to look at, it has a lot of measures. I mean, there are a subset of them that I think I would kind of think of starting at, and it would be interesting, even some of the programs that maybe you have going in from a urban collaborative perspective, if we actually do a little test and control case study.
Well, yeah. So I think there are some obvious, actually, measures. I think happiness is hard to measure, but crime is easy to measure. And so I think crime statistics on a city are known to change. That was a big thing in the United States when New York City became a safe city as opposed to a crime city. And then I think safety especially for at home, safety for my wife and for my daughter at our home was a key measure. I'd spend a lot of money for safety around the house. I spent no problem spending $1,000, $2,000 on a security system. $1,000 on a dog was better than the $1,000. So I think those metrics are very clear in terms of the downside. And I think urban planners have those, downside metrics. Are you hungry? Are you safe? That aren't usually in the GDP conversation, but are fundamental to the safety net measure of those things. And then I think, if we're going to capture the innovation that you talked about around safety, we have to reward it. So it's not just to measure safety. The guy who built the app that wasn't intended for safety, that did provide safety, he should get extra profit to put safety in the next app that he wasn't intending to put safety in. And the same thing with medicine. Doctors get paid to do heart surgery, and doctors get paid to do back surgery. So the correlation to the number of back surgeries in a neighborhood correlates to the number of back surgeons, not to the backs. The heart surgeon count determines the heart surgery rate, not the hearts. That's not the right metrics. So I think if you're going to reward doctors preventing heart surgery and doctors preventing back surgery, you have to reward them for that. So Porter, has made several comments about healthcare where the metrics are wrong, the rewards are wrong, and I think that's an opportunity fundamental to these things. Those kind of, I think, prevention metrics are well documented now. Gwande and several people have talked about more people die of bacteria infection than die of anything else in a hospital. Bacteria infection is how willing the doctors are to wash their hands between patients. So those kinds of things, I think, are quality of life kinds of metrics. And then I think it's the motivation, it's the economics. That we have economic rewards for GDP, and investors are voting money for GDP. No one's voting money for safety for my wife. But me.
Other than Bhutan, are there examples where policymakers are paying attention to any of these indices and making decisions based on these indices?
Not that I've come across. Interestingly, the way I've actually approached this with some of the conversations I've had with policymakers is try and see if I can link that back to something that would appeal to them. So let me use a slightly different example. When we were looking at the whole internet revolution in India, you had a number of people who were opposing it. Right? There was some initial, the initial Rajiv Gandhi had a really tough time bringing in computers into government. Transparency, accountability, speed. Those are not, we need to look at it, we need to examine it, we need to have a committee on it, we need to have a report, and et cetera, et cetera. The way that some of these were able to kind of get turned around was when people realized that, oh, by having this, I'm actually going to have 10,000 more jobs in my constituency. Probably easier for me to get elected. I'm going to be able to allocate additional funding because of this activity. So I think what's important. I always kind of say this is it's important to kind of back to your incentives. So if you can align some of these incentives, so they may not be necessarily thinking of the happiness index, but if some of the activities that they do, based on how we demonstrate how it's actually going to be valuable for them, lead them to the same answer. I'm comfortable with that because I don't think we have all the answers in this space. I'm not sure happiness index actually is a very good measure because that's a personal situation. You decide whether you're happy or not.
But also there may be kinds of happiness that are socially undesirable.
Exactly. I mean, which is to Stan's point. While crime is an important one, as you're aware, the different kinds of crime, have a different impact. So in some sense, obviously, you think of violent crime bad, but actually petty crime. High level of petty crime actually means, has a bigger issue from a home safety perspective because, you're not, typically the violent crime is linked to more serious issues. But, if there's a high level of petty crime, you've got a bigger issue than, systemic issue. So I think there's kind of levels of these aspects that you need to think about as well.
Has anyone done a study, for example, to say if you applied one of these indices to the UK and used that as a policy driver for the allocation of some kind of infrastructure investment, for example, how seriously would that change where money and how money was being invested?
I do recall, I'm not sure it was done for the UK, but I do recall an activity like this that was done for a few states. In fact, we tried to do something similar like this on the Northeast, where we said, if you went the classical approach of, this is what you would do, and if you didn't and you leveraged the strengths you had, this is what you would do. And the impact that it would have. So that started about 5 or 8 years ago. And again, it got interrupted in the middle. There was a change in government and so forth. So I don't think we have results yet. So I think we can do a theoretical analysis of it. Probably a more interesting thing sometimes may be a corporation. So when I agree it's not, it doesn't have as you said, there aren't these clearly defined roles, and it's a little bit more difficult, and the whole concept of a mayor as a CEO has its own connotations. But that may be an example that we could potentially look at, and look at the potential choices that are driven by some of these aspects. And there, I think we have some examples of companies that have prospered because of some of these choices they've made.
I was going to say the corporate sector is probably is the place where there's been the most amount of work and study in this regard.
Right.
And they are looking at, I don't know if you'd call it happiness, but perhaps worker satisfaction. Customer satisfaction. And they've put a lot of effort and investment into determining how you measure that. And then once you've done that, how you begin to apply it and put it into corporate policy. So there's probably a lot of literature on that. Okay. There's also, there are several states in the United States that have done work, including Oregon. And interestingly, the UN has done quite a bit of work in this regard.
What is the UN? I'm not familiar with the UN.
Through UNESCO, they've done some work on this.
That's interesting. Yeah, but you're right on the corporate side. I think that's an interesting, and actually it kind of triggered off another thought in my mind, where you're asking the customer or the stakeholder for their impression. So I may do some, you may not be happy with the electricity, but if the other person is, then that's good. That the quality of life there is, so it's not necessarily a quantitative measure. If you're satisfied with it, you're satisfied with it.
I think this is more like sort of micro-level examples of the sort of thing you've just been talking about there. And I'm remembering two, both from Scandinavia. One was quite a famous example of I think a staircase in a subway where they put touch sensors and lights and a sound system on it. So when you walked up and down the stairs, it played music. And so people would run up and down it because it was fun. And I saw a presentation recently by Copenhagen's city architect, and she talked about various experiments where they had tried to persuade people to spend more time in specific urban environments, obviously because they're trying to bring life to them. And she said one thing that they'd observed was that when you put structures on the street that encourage people to move in unusual ways, it persuades adults and children to play together. And they showed a picture of a trampoline next to a bus stop and a man and his son bouncing up and down. I don't know how systematic the research was behind that, but that's clearly related to happiness in some way. Right. And it was clearly the result of a study. I just wonder how many more examples there are of people experimenting that way at all sorts of scales around the world.
Got it.
Oh. Do you want to answer?
No, please go ahead.
The title here on your slide says Perceptions of Quality of Life. So I'm wondering if we should look at how different groups perceive quality of life for themselves. And I'm particularly thinking, are we concentrating on quality of life for young urban professionals who boost the economy in cities, or are we concerned also with young children, old age pensioners, and I'm sure they'll have very different views of what good quality of life is. There are very few things that you could measure, as well as life expectancy, for example. That could, however, give a really skewed image of a city if you force people of pension age out of the city because it's no longer a good place for them to be. Or if you make cities not attractive for families with young children. And these things are just really hard to measure. And maybe to give a little example of something that I think has a big impact on quality of life. I grew up in the Netherlands, and as a kid I'd ride my bike to school from a very young age. I believe the average is 6.5 for children to go alone unsupervised to school. That gives children a tremendous amount of freedom. They can go to football training, they can visit friends in a neighborhood. It also gives parents a bit of freedom because they don't have to drive them around all the time. Pensioners as well. My grandparents, until just before they passed away, would drive their bike around town in high 70s just to go get groceries, visit people, and visit their grandchildren in a neighborhood. These things are hard to really translate up. I live in London now, I have a family, 2 young children, and they're too young to go to school, but I'm not sure I'd let them ride a bike on London streets aged 6 on their own. The quality of life could be really high in London for young people living in a flat central, having great access to culture and arts, having good income, good opportunities for jobs. But maybe once they have children, they would want to move further out because of these things. So is that something we can take into account? And perceptions of quality of life make that for different groups of people in the city.
Somebody mentioned Copenhagen there. I think it's very interesting. We're just halfway through our latest analysis of the C40s groups, performances around all the actions they've taken in the last 2 years to improve their cities. Mm-hmm. And what we've seen there with regard to measures on how cities make progress is that some cities have got more sophisticated. So in Copenhagen, I think it's Anne, something that the head of planning there, said they know now that the policy they did around cycling and the physical investment in road building and road safety and the planning of transport systems that include cycling on buses or taking cycles onto buses, etc., didn't just mean more people cycled, it took 2% of GDP out of the transport system, and they think that money were spent somewhere else which is more productive, and they measured the carbon environmental impact that policy had. So this is a relatively complex approach, I think, to measuring multiple policy areas and infrastructure investments in a city, going all the way up to then the perceptions of the quality of life or what the citizens really want. I think we almost have elections for that. You know, at that point, we use votes to measure whether a city delivered enough progress with regard to how great it is to live in there. And we have indexes whether people move into cities or don't move into cities and move out of cities. So we might not have to be that perfect in what we measure, but I think we can do a lot more around subsystems of the city where we could measure a lot more.
I have a response, but you want to say something? Yes, it's behind you.
Just wanted to say potentially all these discussions we had about supportive city and the systems, new systems for social engagement, I think they may start becoming, if they get implemented, they may become self-governing and answer a lot of these questions by themselves.
Right. Yeah, no,
Amir wanted to ask a question.
Sure.
Is there a relationship between happiness in terms of measure and actually services or the quality of life in cities? Because this is what I feel from your presentation, that we're trying to link happiness and the question of happiness with actually services and facilities and so on. But I feel sometimes it's not actually related at all. Yeah. But what we are trying to achieve then from asking the question if people are happy or not, because, you know, I mean, you could travel to a village in the middle of nowhere with no facilities at all and people very happy in comparison to people in a city where there are all the facilities there, but people are not happy. And my theory is actually happiness comes sometimes from going from the Maslow's sort of pyramid level from one stage to another. That transient response will bring happiness sometimes, but if you stay on the same level, actually go back to a normal sort of level of happiness, and sometimes you need actually change to bring happiness sometimes and so on. So in a way, it's not an absolute service level.
In fact, I would not equate a happiness to quality of life. So I think happiness is a whole different dimension, which is why I get nervous with some of these happiness indices. So I think happiness is a whole, I mean, there's so many other aspects that drive happiness. There's the whole relative based on where you were and where you went. I mean, so that's not, I mean, I think I don't think I equate that with quality of life. So, so happiness and quality of life. I think happiness is a whole different concept. And so I agree with you in terms of, I think, how you're describing it. I think what we're trying to kind of incorporate through this is that as we think about the smarter city or the intelligent city or all these aspects, you've got to realize that different people are going to look at that list of services or those list of things that they have in different ways, right? And that will impact the quality of life. So it would be different based on maturity levels, regions, cultural issues, and you won't have a standard measure saying, if I've got 99% connectivity, I'm going to have a high quality of life. It's not going to work that way.
I agree that if somebody's an employee or you've got a customer in a company and the customer is happy because of a specific service, it's very easy to quantify. And happy for a customer means you actually you could expect that you have exceeded expectations or actually met expectations of that customer and the service or speed of service and so on. But if you have a person in a city living there, it becomes a very complex process actually to say, is the happiness actually related to anything physical in relation to services or facilities or transportation? They might influence negatively on the happiness, for example, if the bus one day wasn't on time. Sure. But at the same time, if the bus actually arrives every day on time, maybe that life becomes boring.
Every day is the same, right? So
yeah.
No, I agree.
Just this notion of happiness is actually quite direct, and I've been working with some people in clinical services, but the happiness can be directly linked to health issues, and in particular heart problems. And in fact, in terms of preventions of heart attacks and other heart problems, some of the health authorities are spending some of their money on, for example, creating green spaces, more happy environments, if you like, for the people, so that they would have to deal with a lot less health consequences as a result of unhappy people, if you like.
Happiness is not necessarily mental health or a mentally healthy city. Just like a person who might look and act and even think they're happy all the time might have severe mental problems, things that they've suppressed that eventually control their life in some way or another through pathologies. And so when I'm thinking of these models in organizational theory, one of the things we look at is organizational culture. And many different authors, and in fact, there's about as many different definitions of organizational culture as there are organizational scientists. But it deals with things like, how do you determine what's real? How do you determine what's true? What's the process that an organization goes through for truthing before it decides something? What's your orientation in time? Are you future-oriented? Are you past-oriented, trying to protect the past? Are you in the present? Do you have some balance about that? How do you see the role of leadership versus the role of followership? Is this more of an egalitarian, or is it hierarchical, and things like that? And so I'm wondering, in your obviously very large organization, have you looked at cities in terms of their organizational culture as a potential model, or a potential way of modeling a city's health?
Can I ask a follow-up? Or maybe we can catch up after the listening if you want. So, I was just going to kind of figure out because again, back to the point, when you look at a city as opposed to an organization, the hierarchies aren't as defined, and you might actually have circular hierarchies where you might be your own boss, and so.
You don't elect the CEO if you are collecting a paycheck. So.
Right. Okay.
Sorry. Yeah, I have to jump back from the happiness discussion because I tried to get the voice before. So I really liked the idea of vital signs. Yesterday we had this discussion of quality of life, and we ended up maybe into the disappointment that there is so many things that you might maybe measure or get data, but the data is wrong and bad and in wrong place. So simplifying that, and we took as the starting point the Maslow's hierarchy, so maybe we could actually set for ourselves a target to find maybe 5 something to measure. And something that I was thinking maybe like candidates for these 5 things. One thing is that first of all, what are we measuring? I think city, as you mentioned, it's getting blurry. What is actually city and what is countryside? So that's way too big thing, big chunk to be measured at once. And I go back a little bit to Jane Jacobs' ideas of smaller units inside the city, different areas. Some inside very same city, some part may be going to better quality of life and some are decaying. And Jane Jacobs had this idea of unslumming slums. So what actually makes a slum something that is getting better, or maybe the city center that is decaying? And one indicator is the people moving in and out. So according to Jane Jacobs, unslumming slum is a place where people decide to live even if they would have money to move out. And slumming slum is where people stay only because they have to. So if we take smaller units and see the moving in and out and maybe the demographics, who is staying there, are they stayed because they have to, or are they going to build their neighborhood? So that would be one vital sign, but not for the city. It would be for a smaller place. And then for the cycling idea there, I remember it was Jan Gehl from Copenhagen, the architect, said that building streets with this 8/80 idea, that if you can let the 8-year-old child go there alone and 80-year-old grandma going there alone, then the street safety is good. And for the point that maybe London is good for some people, got lots of attractions, I think this street safety is not so that you have to choose either London attractions or street safety. You probably can have London with street safety, but that's another story. So 2 candidate indicators, this 880 and movement in and out from smaller places.
That's a very interesting concept as well, because what is 880 for Copenhagen may be different from than what's 880 for Guangzhou. Because the 880, I'm not kind of comparing cultures or anything, I'm just saying, so again, it's an interesting parameter, but it might mean very different things of what an 8-year-old in Mumbai would do versus an 8-year-old in Copenhagen.
You had a great point about how many people would like to move into the city and move out of the city. Just back to the whole topic of a supportive city, my question to the group here would be, have we even considered how a larger city is actually helping out the rural fragments, or maybe even smaller cities, or maybe the economically disparate sections of other cities? So for instance, doctors in big cities through mobile communication networks can reach out to pregnant women in rural areas and tell them through their scans whether the baby that they're going to give birth to is going to be healthy or not, or if she needs to go and see somebody more serious. Should the definition be extended further to say that it's not only supporting its own citizens, but also citizens who are not supported directly through them? You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Sure, you want to say something?
I mean, what to take away a bit from your presentation is like almost like every situation requires different approach in a way, and in a certain way.
Anyway, I don't think so.
Well, I mean, you have a kind of template, but each time you're going to adapt it in a way.
Which is probably true for anything you do in life, right? I mean, it doesn't mean that when I adapt a template, doesn't mean I'm creating a new method or framework. Sorry, but I interrupted you. Please go ahead.
Well, I mean, it's a question of like, it might be a question of scale, of location, and so on. So at the end, you might do, I mean, it might look like with the same heading, but the content are different. Why I'm saying this, because I mean, we've done measuring health, for example, in relationship to the built environment on a longitudinal study in Wales for, 50 years of kind of data, or no less, 30 years of data. So we find relationship. Now, we cannot take this to London, and vice versa. We done vitality study on High Street in London. We cannot take them to Cardiff, because they are very different kind of scale, different people living around, and so on. So this is interaction. Even if we had the same, I would say, built environment, let's say in a different place, or with different people, the outcome will be different, because the affordance that people will kind of interpret that environment will be different. Do you understand the notion of affordance? Affordance is interpreting something as a resource. And interpreting something as a resource is bound to be cultural one, is bound to be kind of group-based and so on. So I mean, there's, in the question of modeling those things, in a way, when you go from a health check, which you have like so 6 indicators, but behind it you have a network of causalities that allow you to do the diagnosis.
Well, those are that's the analysis bit, but still my 6 causalities. So for example, when I drive on, whether I drive on the Autobahn or I drive in India, still kilometers per hour, it's still, right? Then the impact of that is because I have a huge traffic jam in India, which doesn't allow me. So from my perspective, I think, the answers, yes, the answers would be different. The diagnosis, so the diagnosis could vary, just like in the medical, so when you take everybody's, those 5 or 6 signs, the initial set of the template of questions you may ask, you could potentially group based on certain characteristics. The answers you get and the diagnosis you do, and then what action you take, whatever recovery plan or continuance plan or sustenance plan may vary.
But even within that kind of group, let's say, it's quite interesting to listen to the analogy you take, like the car, like a machine kind of based or the kind of health system, which is like the body and so on. City is not the body. When in a city,
is a pretty complex system,
your arm is not kind of going to fight against the other arm, but in a city you have like part of the kind of like society that might fight another one or kind of try to do certain things. When the body has a certain integrity, that kind of like, well, there's certain vitality that go in one direction. Yeah? So I will kind of like, analogy are good and models of way of thinking, but I think city are kind of a different type of kind of problem in a way. I'm not saying they are like whatever, but they have their particularity. And that's what I kind of like take from your presentation, is this kind of high dependency on kind of local condition. Of course.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But I still believe the high. So I guess there may be a semantics issue here.
Yeah.
So
it's a question of degree, maybe.
Sorry.
A question of degree.
Yes, possible. But I still believe. I think that. I think you may be expanding your definitions to get the grouping, so it may not all fit in the right. So in the imperfect thing saying is Cardiff the same as location X, but I would be happy to take up a challenge that I could find another Cardiff somewhere else. I'll have to look really hard.
You have to look very hard.
But I can. But see, that's the unique part, is that you kind of find odd similarities.
No, but I think all the conference I've been attending on kind of city always start with one thing, a sentence which everybody agree. Every place is unique, and the rest of the conference is about almost like denying it.
But I think that's a little. Sorry, yeah,
again, the cycling is always an interesting example. When the 2 French cities launched the cycling scheme, and then the benefits were analyzed around well-being, health, carbon, congestion, cost of travel in the city, it becomes a pretty obvious intervention to use. And now there are 14 or 16 out of the megacities in the C40 network, all rolling out cycling schemes. They've all been to Paris to see how Paris have done it, and they think it's highly transferable. Obviously, the execution in Beijing is different from Mexico City, is different from New York, but the principle of transferability of a solution does apply. So yes, every city is unique, and the.
Talk about outcome here. You have to kind of think about outcome as well. It's not about just you can apply it.
But well, my point is, as professionals in cities, we keep thinking that every city is unique.
I think we're in
and every city needs unique, bespoke solutions to every problem they face. We just run out of time and steam to solve the challenges in front of us. And some things are in common and some things are transferable, whether you're I mean, the other argument we always hear is developing and developed city are completely different. You know, the use of micropayment and mobile technologies, when we looked at that as an intervention in Chwane for creating a formal economy, are highly applicable as a technology, just very different to the way we use it in London for paying for your cappuccinos at £3 or £4 a cappuccino, whatever you do. But again, the idea that Chwane and London are the same obviously doesn't apply, but things are similar or transferable between the two. And the stream that every city is completely unique, I think is quite a dangerous concept in that sense.
Is it, in what sense is it dangerous, kind of, to think about?
Well, India will have another 800 million people moving into cities. China will have a huge population moving into cities. If we try to solve every citizen's and every city's problem for them individually and locally and not transfer any of these concepts across and between cities, we just run out of time in dealing with the resource decoupling issue, with the job creation issue, with, you know, there are all sorts of challenges cities face right now where we need to apply concepts that are transferable.
When you go to your GP, do you hope that he treats you as a person, or do you hope he treats you as anybody else?
But again, sorry. But again, I'm hoping that the GP is actually basing his experience not on each individual person, but on the. So there is commonality, right? So
that's what we have to construct. It seems that, I mean, what we need, I mean, is beyond, and this is kind of like knowledge, which is like, how do we kind of like, what is this network of causality that, I mean, crime is not, for example, is not an uncontested issue. Crime in New York has been interpreted as a kind of like this petty crime war, or some people have given a completely different interpretation, saying it was more about allowing women to have like abortion 20 years before. So there's different kind of story about the same.
The Freakonomics, I mean.
In a way. So I mean, the question is understanding outcome in a kind of rather kind of solid way. I agree with that.
Yeah, I mean, I still believe. I think the causality and the outputs, I think, you know, might be different, but I think I do believe that, and I think almost the lesson or the important aspect is realizing what is transferable and what isn't. What's the worst thing you can do is actually trying to take something that isn't transferable and actually transfer it. Right? But I think that,
how do you determine that?
Oops. I suddenly had a high-pitched voice. Sorry. I think that's where the expertise, you know, that we develop over a period of time, which, you know, and sometimes it comes through mistakes. So.
Well, obviously this isn't the topic of discussion, so.
I hope I was able to meet some of the characteristics that Stan set out earlier. So.